Hey everybody, couple of notes before we get started with today's episode. We invited a Franciscan friar to join us this week, so it shouldn't come as any great surprise that the conversation took a turn for the Reverend. That said, we decided no snazzy intro teaser, and also no ad break interruptions this time around. So I guess we're sorry, and you're welcome. Oh, and a quick heads up that right as we were about to wrap up this episode, the connection died, so if the ending seems more abrupt than usual, that's why. But thankfully, we were able to get Brother Richard back into the virtual studio for a really wonderful epilogue, which I'll tell you a bit more about at the end. Until then, peace be with you, fellow travelers.
Spectrovision Radio.
Welcome to Gods, Ghosts, and UFOs, the biggest podcast in the universe where we talk about all the things they said weren't real. My name is Tom, and I'm joined by my friends and co-hosts, Jordan and Mallory. Hello, my dears.
Hello.
Hello, hello.
And we're also joined today by a very special guest. Brother Richard Hendrick stands smiling at the intersection of every path of inquiry we take on Gods, Ghosts, and UFOs. A priest friar of the Irish branch of the ancient Capuchin Franciscan order, Brother Richard is also an articulate expression of his ancestral Celtic mysticism. As he himself once said, he comes from a people who embrace faith but did not let go of magic and understand that one completes the other. While he's also the host of the Daily Meditation, I first encountered Brother Richard on Modern Fairy Sightings, our wonderful sister podcast on Spectrovision Radio, and I thought, how adorable for Joe to invite a mendicant monk on the show for a refreshing change of pace, until Brother Richard launched into a masterclass about the Fae as living beings and how much we've forgotten about the sacred nature of both them and ourselves, much less our venerable relationship. I can say with confidence that anyone else unfamiliar with today's guest is in for similar surprise and delight. Brother Richard, it is a privilege to welcome you on the show.
It's a privilege to be invited. Thank you very much. The joy of being a mendicant, a wandering friar, as you mentioned, is that we go wherever we're welcome, and very often people get stuck with us then. So watch out.
I don't think anyone would complain in your case. I want to take advantage of my time on the mic to ask you this question, which I had not planned to ask. But we are talking 2 days after yet another killing at the hands of federal agents in Minnesota. And, we are very interested not only in the nature of the subtle world, but in the practical concerns of what it means to live in the mystery. And so people like us tend to be more sensitive and empathetic. And the downside to that kind of vulnerability is that when things like this happen and the cruelty of the world is laid at our feet, many of us struggle with painful feelings of anger, grief, and powerlessness. And I would love right off the bat to get your good counsel on how better to deal with the feelings like that.
Okay, well, I suppose I'm not going to comment on the politics of things, because I think that way lies separation and discouragement and argument. But we can begin at least with the idea that the fundamental place where humanity flowers fully is when compassion is engaged. No matter what tradition you come from, I think you can accept that. So if we take it at the compassion level, then one of the things that being compassionate bestows upon us is not just the duty of compassion that moves outwards, that goes towards the other, but is also the understanding that we have to hold ourselves with compassion as well, to recognize that there is a vulnerability implied by actually choosing the compassionate path. Because most hatred, most anger really comes from a place of fear. more than anything else. In our tradition, at least, when we contemplate the emotional states of human beings, what we would normally say is that anger externalized is actually internalized fear. So the thing that displaces fear, that begins to actually undo fear and stops fear begetting anger, which begets hatred eventually. And I realize I'm sounding a little like Yoda now at the moment, but he stole it from us. One of the difficulties about that is that if you are choosing to stand in the compassionate place, even in resistance to oppression, then one also has to accept vulnerability in the midst of that. And that is the vulnerability to be hurt, to be rejected in the compassionate place, but also to try and make sure that you are not losing compassion even for those who are rejecting your compassion. And that's the hardest place of all to be, the hardest point of all to be. And yet, time and time again in history, what we see is if people manage that, that's when the other who's in anger, the other who's in fear, the other who's in hatred is actually disassembled and overcome. It is in violent resistance or in anger or in hatred that when we allow hatred of us to beget hatred of them, that it becomes impossible for the situation to move on and to become a place of rationality, a place of growth, a place of rapprochement, a place of healing. And the danger is those who are moving in a hateful way or in an angry way, they also know this. And they want, at least maybe unconsciously, but what they want is hatred in return, because that then justifies their action. So when they push and push and push, waiting for the explosion is what then justifies the action in their mind. And so as difficult as it may be, and I speak only from my own path, which is the Franciscan path, the path and St. Francis was an extraordinary peacemaker. The only way forward is to recognize constantly, to hold the truth constantly, that no matter how different the other is from me and no matter how much hatred they are pouring on me, fundamentally, I have a brother or a sister in front of me. And I have to try and speak to the essential goodness of that other human being and reach out as best I can to the little frightened child that's in there, most of which they are unaware of, but that is slowly begetting hatred and anger as a way of defending against this interior fear, which is usually a fear of the other, and which is usually a fear that if there was just basic conversation would overcome the fear very, very easily and very quickly. But as long as I can label you as different from me and therefore to be feared and create a narrative of you're out to get me, then I can justify anything because I'm justifying it in self-defense. And so I will push you to get the violent act from you, even though I'm actually the aggressor myself, that will then justify it. And it becomes that circle. So I think for those who are trying to hold the compassionate solidity, three things. The first is hold yourself in compassion. So when the anger rises in you, because it's natural, it's a natural reaction, to recognize it as such. But then to receive it as what it is. It's a survival reaction. And to understand that it doesn't have to actually countermand the compassionate stance. It just needs to be recognized, received with love, and rested with those that you surround yourself with who are actually compassionate. The second thing then is to take refuge in the great teachers and the great teachings of all traditions that speak towards compassion, because we've done this before. We've done this over thousands of years, and we know how to do it. So to hold to that, you don't have to reinvent it. It's all there. There's great wisdom there, whether it's in the civil rights movement in the United States, or whether it's in the peaceful protests in India, or whether it's in the ability, even as far back as the Irish, when they began the independence movement. First, it began as a non-violent movement. So all of those things are there. And the third and final piece, I would say, is that it is really, really important to manage the basic human needs in the midst of all this. Because people who are full of angst and energy, even in a compassionate way, will often forget their own survival needs. And they become tired, and they become worn, and they become even more anxious. And you will make very bad decisions based on lack of sleep and lack of food and lack of shelter. So to have some kind of a system or situation that revolves people so that they can actually receive shelter and receive support and receive the basic bodily needs being mentioned. I mean, we all know that old maxim that, no good decision is ever made at 2 a.m. No good decision, because that's not where the human brain works best. So we need to make sure that we're doing the practical, we're doing the communitarian, and we're doing the self-compassion, and I would include spirituality solidly in that. Naturally, that's where I'm coming from. But that part of that self-compassion practice is there as well. Because if we have that creates a solid foundation that enables an engagement with the other that does not allow them to push us into a violent act whereby then they become justified. And it also allows the childishness, actually, of what's going on from top to bottom to be revealed for what it is. And for that fear to come to the surface and to actually be challenged and recognized as a real thing that has to be dealt with, but as something that then can be opened up in a way that allows some kind of reconciliation. Because in the end, no matter when this comes to an end, people are still going to have to live with people. So how do you do that in such a way that a just society can move forward? You have to speak truth. You have to move towards reconciliation. And if those two things aren't present, then all that happens is it goes down and it simmers in the underbelly and in the unconscious, and eventually it comes back up again. So sorry, a long answer to a short question, but that's, I think it's important.
It may have been short, but it wasn't small. So thank you.
Thank you.
Well, and I think that a lot of what you're describing is so useful in so many different realms. One of the things we discuss quite a bit on this podcast is how destabilizing approaching different concepts of reality can be. And I think that it can bring up this fear in a very similar way. And so regardless of whether or not you might be finding yourself in what feels like a powerlessness with people, sometimes you're going to find that with reality, with God, with your spirituality, regardless. And so I find your advice very, very practical on many, many levels. And I really appreciate it. And I actually think it also applies very well to what we discuss on this podcast. And actually, you as a person, I was very, very excited once I started reviewing conversations that Tom sent us to review before this discussion. And because you are, I grew up Christian as well, but I didn't grow up with a Christianity that really allowed for a lot of the mysticism and, I don't know, high strangeness or embracing non-human intelligence outside of, ancestors, angels, demons. Those are the sorts of things that were familiar to me in my upbringing. So my question for you would be, has your religious experience always involved the mystical? Or was this something that came to you over time? And I would love to hear a little bit more about when those worlds merged for you, or if they've always been merged.
So I suppose, for those who don't know who are out there, I'm a Catholic monk of the Franciscan order. And the Capuchins are a branch of the Franciscan order where we center ourselves on meditation as the essence of our contemplative prayer, and then from meditation out into compassionate action in the world. Okay, so that's the kind of philosophy behind it. So as a result, the day-to-day life is a life that brings the very practical and the very mystical and brings them together and fuses them together. We have a maxim within the order that no action should arise that hasn't come out of meditation, out of contemplation. And we strive for that as a principle. It's not always the case, but we strive for that. So I was hugely attracted to this particular form of life. And I think that was because Well, number one, the Irish psyche, I mean, Tom mentioned it on the way in the introduction, the Irish psyche is one that is, without, descending into cliches, but it lives and has always lived, and maybe it's part of that Celtic spirit, but it has lived always with one foot in this world and one foot in the next. So much so that famously George Bernard Shaw said, "You'll know the Irish because they treat weddings as funerals and funerals as weddings." And tongue in cheek, but there's a certain sense of that. There's a certain sense, when you attend an Irish funeral or an Irish wake of the experience of, they got there, it's completed. There might be sadness or sorrow around it naturally, but there's also that idea, particularly if it's somebody who's elderly, of, well, fair play to them. They made it, and now we celebrate them. And as a result, I grew up in a family that would have seen itself as a very normally practicing Catholic family. It wasn't anything hugely devotional or anything like that. Different members had different ways of living it. But there was a very strong familial line going through my mother into my grandmother and her people, who would have been nowadays, I suppose, characterized as kind of healers, or we would have called them, the traditional name was sharp women. They were known as sharp women. And they were women who had a great sense of the other world, and a great sense of meaning and the understanding of being able to kind of read the symbols around and all of that kind of stuff, while being absolutely 100% living within the Christian Catholic sphere. And that went all the way back. I mean, we've traced it as far back as we can, and there's elements of it all the way back. It came to some of the boys, but mostly it was passed down through the women. And all kinds of different bits and pieces. So I grew up in that atmosphere where faith and this world and the internal understanding that there is a mystery that is communicating itself to us all of the time, and that the natural world is actually involved in that mystery. And that, if you're quiet enough and open enough, everything is trying to speak, everything is trying to talk to you. That was just normal. And it was only when I entered the order and met others, who were drawn to the order for different reasons, different ways, that I began to realize, actually, a lot of people don't have this experience. So it wasn't like there was any kind of specialness to this. This was just seen as, this is how you live. This was the ordinary way. So, life was folklore, but lived in a very strong way. So, we just lived ordinarily, knowing you didn't bring that plant into the house at particular times. The mirrors had to be covered the minute somebody was dying. You opened the doors, on New Year's Eve at 10 to midnight, because the old year had to leave and the new year had to come in. Anybody who crossed the threshold had to be fed. That's a huge Irish thing. Like, you're insulting somebody if they don't get to feed you along the way, no matter what they have. So there were all of these bits and pieces. And then it went a bit deeper, I suppose, particularly with my grandmother. My grandmother was a very, very important influence for me. And I mean, now looking back, I would say she was my first teacher in meditation. Now, she wouldn't have known what that word was, but that's what she did. She sat with the fire. She spoke to the dead. She taught me to sit with the fire and to kind of lose yourself in the fire, which was basically unfocusing so as to be present, And there were all of those little elements that came down, but mixed in with that was absolute faith and absolute trust in a God who was involved in the minutiae of life. This wasn't a God very, very distant, off ruling the universe from a distant throne. This was the Lord who knew that you didn't have enough in your bank account for dinner on Tuesday, and so you went down and asked St. Anthony to send somebody, or to send a friend with a favor, and it happened, and you were assured it would happen, and there was a kind of a confidence lived with that. I mean, confidence actually means confidere, to live with faith. So this was the idea. It was part of the warp and woof of life. And then when I encountered, and stop me by the way if I go on too long in any answer.
No, never stop.
When I encountered the story of St. Francis, which I did when I was about 14 or so. I was heading towards, my plan at that stage in life was I was heading towards the sciences. I had huge interest in biology, zoology particularly. That's what I thought I was heading towards at that stage. Though I was always asking the big questions, the deep questions. That was why I was handed off to my grandmother so often. It was like, go and chat to Granny about that stuff. So that was moving in the background. And then I thought at a conscious level I was heading for the sciences, and then somebody handed me a book on St. Francis. And suddenly these two worlds of kind of the natural world, the appreciation of nature, and the idea of faith and mysticism just met in this person. And it sparked something in me. And I decided I needed to find out if these people still existed. I didn't know if they did or not. And I got in touch with the friars, and I met these very ordinary, nobody was floating around the place. There were no halos. People were doing ordinary work, but they were doing good work. They were looking after the homeless. They were with the poor. It was a monastery filled with laughter, just as much as chant and silence and stillness. There was an ordinariness to them, and every one of them described themselves, as I would to this day, as a work in progress, And I began to realize that there was an authenticity to this that was really deep. And that's what kind of drew me in. So they're the kind of the three threads that kind of moved around that brought me into this particular experience. And the great gift of the Franciscan tradition is the understanding that every single person and every being you are meeting, regardless whether they are of your tradition or not, whether they believe in anything, everything that you are meeting is a word from divine mystery to you. And your response has to be a response of reverence and respect and listening. So as to discern what that word is that's being spoken to you in that moment. And that sets you up then for this. That's why brother isn't just a title for us like Mr. or Professor or whatever. The idea is that that's supposed to remind me that anybody who encounters me is supposed to encounter a brother, as in someone who's equal and who has their back and who's interested in pulling out the spark of divine mystery from them, whether they know it or not.
And would you apply that to non-people as well?
Absolutely. Every being. The great term at the moment is non-human intelligence, and it's being spoken about as though this is something new and we've discovered it and we're about to announce it or disclose it or whatever. And meanwhile, all of the great spiritual traditions, all of them are sitting back going, for thousands and thousands of years, this is what we've been dealing with, talking about, speaking about. Now, maybe in different ways and with different understandings, different taxonomies, perhaps, would be the way to put it. But it's not a surprise. It's only in the last 200 or so years that the Western world has forgotten that non-human intelligence is everywhere. That it's actually that we're the unusual ones, being this meld of physicality and spirit and mentality and consciousness and all of that sort of stuff. But that we're surrounded constantly by this, whatever you want to call it, consciousness field or the souls of the dead or whatever you want to call it, it doesn't matter. But that all of the great mystics of all of the great traditions have constantly taught that consciousness is present in everything at its particular levels, at its particular, appropriate levels, and that it's perfectly possible to communicate with it. The famous fantasy writer Terry Pratchett famously said, it's believed in every world in which they exist that orangutans can talk, but choose not to, for fear that human beings would put them to work. The truth is that orangutans can speak human perfectly, but we do not know how to speak orangutan. So there's a certain sense of arriving at a point where you recognize the thing in front of me, the tree, the stone, the human being, the non-person, the alien, whatever you want to call it. If it exists as a manifestation, a calling forth from divine mind, we would say. Okay, whatever you want to call the ultimate transcendent ground of being. And as a result, there is a familial connection between us and it. Because every element that is in them is in me. So this means then that there is the possibility of communication. Now, something might decide, I don't want to talk to you. Fine, it's made a choice. But it doesn't mean I can't talk to it. Now, it may mean I'm speaking French and it's speaking Italian. Okay, fine. We can try and find a bit of understanding between the linguistics or the modes of communication or whatever. But it still means that in that fundamental transcendent unity from which everything emerges, there is the possibility at least of mutual understanding.
Oh, that goes on a t-shirt for me. That's really beautiful. I want to ask you, because I'm one of the advantages and also one of the hazards of doing a podcast like this is that I feel our listeners' brains, sort of like while we're having conversations, like I feel their eyes and their ears and their attention. And I think I sometimes, preemptively feel maybe the questions that would come up. And I know that, one of the things that we're cautious about is an over credulity, so to speak, where sort of like, everything is just automatically true. We do I personally choose to a posture of default belief a lot of the time, just for the sake of that sort of relational context that you're talking about. I think that it's just good practice. It's humanist to believe people first, unless there becomes a reason not to believe them. But then, you've got I think a very respectable and large contingent of our audience and anybody who has any interest in these subjects, who will say things like extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, etc. Right? Sure. These are sort of cliched at this point, but I guess being sensitive to that kind of listener who's like, a lot of this stuff sounds pretty gobbledygook to me. Like a lot of this stuff sounds like people who are very deeply respectful of scientific materialism and who maybe haven't stepped as far outside of that world as maybe we have or are trying to. There's definitely like a real caution around talking about things like the consciousness of all things and non-human intelligences and the world of the Fae. And
Sure.
and one particular thing that I wanted to bring up, because this is one of the things that kind of emerged from the conversation you had with Joe Hickey Hall about folkloric traditions around how to relate to fairies or any other kinds of spirits or beings that are passed down and that are generational and that feel very genuine and real and substantial and that seem to work. And it's interesting because, in the post quote unquote Enlightenment era, we call that stuff superstitious. And that's pejorative. That's just like, we say superstitious because we're like, that's not real. Like you're doing something for yourself. You're not doing something that's real. But there are so many stories about people doing those kinds of things that have an effect of some kind. And I have just a couple of very short thoughts that I would love to get your reaction to. Sure. And one of them is just this idea that what those kinds of actions are, what those quote unquote superstitious rituals or traditions are, is basically embodied intention. So it's taking one person or maybe a community of people, and there's a commitment to a reality there, or there's a commitment to an appreciation or respect of a wider sort of sphere of intelligence, etc. And that the way that respect is communicated or enacted doesn't really matter. It's that it is enacted in a way, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And so it's not about like so you couldn't put it in a lab. Like I remember you talking about the how iron is like a really powerful thing to sort of incorporate into some of these traditions. And then you listed out the reasons why. And they were not scientific reasons. They were thematic or symbolic reasons, right? And so you couldn't take a piece of iron and put it in a box and take it to a lab and unpack why it had power in folkloric traditions. You would have to do that in a way that was experienced. And so that, to me, that's a very important kind of like tension between the sort of two halves, I would say, or of the audience. When I say two halves of the audience, I'm not really talking about group A and group B. I'm talking about kind of like the two halves of like warring kind of inner egos that we all deal with, living in post-Enlightenment culture. I'll stop myself, but sure. That's kind of what's on my mind right now.
The first thing to say is that there's absolutely nothing wrong with being skeptical in the full sense of the word, right? Two things that the skeptics very often speak of is scientific method and Occam's razor, and both of those were proposed in their traditional sense by Franciscan friars. William of Occam is the friar who proposed Occam's razor, which is often misquoted, but it's the idea that one doesn't have to multiply entities to get to a particular. You take the simplest course between two things, right? That's the first one. And the second thing, the scientific method, where it is classically spoken of as thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Those three were created by Francis Bacon. So we're absolutely no problem with the scientific method, and many of our brothers work within the sciences, which a lot of people are kind of, what? They don't understand that at all, but we do. So we work within that. Having said all of that, I think what you're saying is really important, which is the idea of wisdom that is passed down in that particular way very often is another way of knowing, right? It's an inherent way of knowing that doesn't necessarily beget very easily, at least, the idea of the laboratory and the taking it apart, okay, because that method, that particular scientific method, is a methodology that comes from a mechanistic understanding of the universe that comes on from about 1600 onwards, okay? And as we know, even physicists now at this stage are saying that particular model works, it works where there's a certain mechanistic sense needed, but actually, if we want to get to the very root of things, if we're talking about quantum effects on things, etc., and I'm always very wary of using that word quantum, but anyway, I'm using those kind of, right the way down to that field of quantum physics. At that point, then we're in a situation where the mechanics, at least, either we don't know them, we don't understand them, or they simply don't exist in the way that we understand them, right? So take all of that out of the way and talk about iron for a minute, okay? Because in that particular conversation, what I spoke about was the iron being known as the thrice blessed element, okay? So it's born of fire, purified by human intention, human work. And then in the Christian understanding of the West, it was iron that had been used to crucify Christ and was so rendered sacred forever because of that. And because we also carry iron in the blood. Now, that may be simply generations worth of people going, for whatever reason, when I put the scissors or the poker there, they don't come in. And so they generate a narrative of causality based on that. Okay? Which is the three teachings that I've spoken about. It may very well be that there is a clear scientific reason. So, for example, going back to the famous Terry Pratchett again, he proposed that iron affected elves and fairies because they were higher up on the electromagnetic spectrum than us. And so it affected their way of seeing and perceiving, right? It bent their way of seeing and perceiving, okay? Proposing a scientific way. The farmer who is upset that the fairies are turning his milk doesn't care. What he wants is something that makes them go away, okay? Yeah. And if somebody says to him, if you leave a lump of iron in the barn, they're not going to come in. And he does it and it works, it gets passed down. So human beings, by and large, are not mechanistic or even skeptical in their interiority. They are utilitarian. And folklore emerges from a utilitarian place. If I'm told that the berries on that tree are good until the 31st of October, and it's safe for the children to eat them, then that's great. And I will stop them on the 31st of October. And maybe there's a story about the fairy spitting on them or the devil passing them by or, the evil wind that comes and corrupts them or whatever. When in actual fact, we all know that the insects begin to burrow into them and there's fungal corruption and disease and all of that kind of stuff. And let's face it, if you're going to eat a whole load of fungal berries, then the chances are you're probably going to see stuff anyway. Well, there is an earthy truth in all of this. Now, the problem is the skeptic then goes, oh, it's either or. Mm-hmm. The folklorist and the mystic say, no, it's both and. And they're two distinctive ways of seeing the world. The skeptic scientific either or works very well in a mechanistic universe. The mystic both and works in a universe of meaning, where we begin to understand that everything that is around us is actually calling us to truth. So my usual remark to the person who comes from a very skeptical end of things is to say, right, absolutely, pursue it. Pursue truth 100%. Keep pursuing it. And if it turns out that I'm wrong along the way and you can show that to me, I'll accept that because the core of my life is to seek truth. What is not a true skeptic is someone who just says, I believe it can't be, therefore it isn't. That's someone who is just basically put a bag over their own head. And often that comes from a place of fear as well. Because it comes from a place of saying, if I can't understand it, then it's dangerous. And we live in a very wild and dangerous universe. And the vast majority of the great spiritual traditions tell us that literally every choice we make has eternal significance. You know? And that's why, whether it's Buddhism or Hinduism or Judaism or Taoism or shamanism or Christianity or whatever, they will all speak to the idea of living an authentic life, or at least a life that's trying to be authentic, with a compassionate understanding, an understanding that I'm part of a great community and network of being, and that what I do has effects beyond even my own knowing. And the skeptic says that's impossible, but then goes and speaks about the butterfly effect.
Yeah,
it's the same. It's the same thing. But in the end, the human being is always going to come down to the utilitarian. What keeps me alive? What keeps me safe? What gives me meaning?
I started the episode talking about the practicalities of living in the mystery, and I was really struck, again, listening to another episode, I think, on modern fairy sightings, and you were talking about the things that you just mentioned, your grandmother, the hearth, hospitality, feed anyone that comes through the door. And then you started talking about, and this must have been around Christmas, but I don't remember, maybe I don't remember, but you were talking about the culture that you grew up in was very much one that was communally based. And so I remember you saying you always give alms to people who ask, especially if they're a musician, and particularly if they're playing the harp, because they could be fae. And I hope that's accurate. But the other thing that really struck me was this idea of simple recognition, just what we do to each other as people. And I thought, well, okay, a lot of people, a lot of entities, if they're fae or if they're ghosts or whatever, are differently abled and differently empowered than we are, and therefore can be quite frightening if you can't see them, or they can do things that you can't do, and that can be frightening. And when you're frightened, you tend to put up obstacles and walls. And the corollary to that, I think, also is that human beings generally, especially this day and age, don't value themselves, I think, as much as they should or understand their true nature. So a lot of the impediment to interacting with creatures who may be open to interacting, that are creatures including your fellow man as well as those of the unseen world, is simply this idea of the peer relationship, the mutual sort of respect and acknowledgement. And I wonder if you could speak more to that.
Yeah, I think if we look at older ways of being, older civilizations, even indigenous civilizations today, the understanding is that the individual, the human being, as a person, only comes into the fullness of who they are when they're in relation to the group, to the community. And that isn't just the community of human beings, it's the full community, the whole cosmos. So one of the things that the Western world does not give to human beings anymore is a cosmology of meaning. And this was particularly bestowed in traditional societies and communitarian societies, right as someone was entering adolescence. So, anthropologists would call this kind of the rites of initiation, or the entry into adulthood. And it was codified. So the young person already had a map, and the map was given in the great mythologies, okay? We can think of the hero's journey, the heroine's journey, whatever. Whenever I'm teaching about this with young people, we never say the heroine's journey anymore, because they immediately go to drugs. But the hero over everybody, masculine, feminine, male, female. So the stories are still there, and we're hungry for those stories. Like, why are the stories of Tolkien, the stories of the Marvel Universe, the stories of Star Wars, etc., why are they being repeated? Because we're hungry for stories that bestow meaning, that says to a young person, you are special, you have a gift that's going to be bestowed. Yes, you will face trials and problems along the way, but you will find a community that will support you and that will allow the full flowering of that gift. Because that's essentially right down to the essence of it. That's what that is. But it also tells the truth. And the truth is, you can get it wrong. you will make errors, you will hurt people, and there may be decisions made that are so wrong you mightn't be able to come back from them. So be careful. You need guidance and wisdom along the way. So we tell the stories, but then we don't provide the framework to allow the story to come up. So we have all of these young people who are hungry for meaning. But what does society tell them? Society, and particularly the society of media and social media, essentially tells them utterly individual. You have to be 100% unique, while at the same time living your life in absolute comparison with others the whole time. Okay? So you measure yourself against others, but you have to be completely unique. That is utter frustration. It's a path to madness. Okay? And then what it says is, oh, and by the way, the goal of the human life cycle now is to be an adolescent for as long as possible. Which traditional societies never said. They said, adolescence is a necessary stage. We will help you. We'll keep you safe while you're going through it. But eventually you will come to adulthood. And then the goal was to become a sage at the end of life, where you had integrated life wisdom, and now your very being was wealth to the community. So these rites of initiation were created so that the young person codified with the stories, the fairy stories, etc., went in at a young age. The map is there. And then they go through the experience of the adventure. And what's the adventure? The body grows and changes. Sexuality switches on. There is the whole finding of identity, all of that kind of stuff. Now, while that's going on, the tribe or the community around them give them the experience of testing themselves in a safe way. Then what they do is they say, by the way, we have some wisdom for you, which nobody has ever told you before. And here's the wisdom. And it's the same wisdom no matter where you go. And the wisdom is explained slightly differently, but it's always the same, is you are absolutely unique and necessary. The cosmos needs you. And what you bring, nobody else can bring. But that also means everybody else is unique and has a unique gift. So you have to respect everybody else as well. And it's in working together that we move forward. And the last piece of it is, now we bring you into an experience that will give you an experience of divine or transcendent mystery, where you will meet the ancestors, you will encounter the divine, you will discover that the land is speaking, and you will find that you're at home within it. And wherever you go in this world, you are connected to us. You have responsibility to us, and we have responsibility to you. That is the safest, most beautiful container any human being can grow up in. And what we've done in the West is we've kept the stories, because the stories, I think, to be honest, are encoded, I would say, at a soul level, let alone a cellular level. We tell them whether we know we're telling them or not. You know, the young person looks for them and goes after them. But we've lost the experience of actually transitioning through. So when I engage with people who are from deep community, and I mean community in the positive sense, because community can be, a cult, for example, not a cult, but a cult is the perversion of that. It's the complete perversion of that, right? And a religion can pervert that as well if it's not lived well or properly. A family can pervert that as well if it's not lived properly. But if it is lived with the fullest sense that I'm talking about, where it's lived from the map fully, then what you get is a human being that grows up knowing, I am unique, the universe needs me, I have to fulfill a purpose. I may not ever know what that is, but I know that it's fulfilled in my interaction with everybody else, and that everybody else is on the same path. And that gives a tremendous freedom, and it also gives a respect and reverence for those who have gone further along, chronologically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, etc. So now I'm posed in a position where the elderly are preserved for their wisdom and are supported by the working familial end of things. The young are guided and protected so as to be brought into the fullest sense of who they are. And the flowering of their various gifts, whatever those gifts are, is actively encouraged. Now, obviously, I'm speaking from the ideal situation, because human beings of every description get it wrong along the way, But I think our biggest problem is that if we don't have that, the human being will live the rest of their life with a sense of frustration, a sense that the other should be fixing me in some way. And this is where relationships and marriages and all of that fall apart, because they meet the other thinking, oh, you're the one who's going to fix me. Or even worse, don't worry, I'm going to fix you. And what happens there then is that the actual complementarity that's meant to happen in intimate relationship never actually happens. And then you end up in a situation where these adults now have children and they don't know how to bring them forward either. Or they spend their whole life just seeking, but never actually. Because we have a generation of spiritual seekers who don't know that the first step in spiritual seeking is discipline. And because they're undisciplined in every other aspect of their life, they can't bring discipline to spirituality. And so they'll constantly just seek experience rather than discipline. And discipline is what eventually gives us the experience, but in a safe way. Anyway, that's way too much, but that's what I think is going on.
You walked right up to the line of the question that I had banked, which is,
okay,
what do you do if you're missing one of those experiences? And I will say, from a personal standpoint, I feel, and this is just strictly personally, I speak for no one else. I can't even speak for Mallory, because like we grew up in the same church, but like our experiences, of course, were going to be totally different because we're from different places, different families, different people. So, but my experience was, I feel like I got the story, and the story was really good, and I still embrace the story. I think the story is really beautiful, and I got the sense of personal worth, and I got the sense of communal worth and how important other people were. And I still hold on to that, and that still feels very powerful to me. What I feel like I'm missing is the piece of confirmation of that sort of transcendent experience. I don't feel like, if I trace my life backward, I feel like I've been chasing that confirmation for my whole life, and
sure.
and am just going all different directions for it. Frankly, it's one of the reasons this podcast exists, because like I'm chasing and hungry and don't know why. And when I heard you say that, because you said this thing to Joe Hickey Hall, I stopped the podcast and wrote out this question, which was like, what do we do? Like, what does a person do if they recognize that they're missing a really important piece of that transition to adulthood?
This is a question I get asked all the time. So it's not, I mean, the first thing to say is it's not just you. You know, I mean, that's the first thing.
Well,
the second
yeah.
thing is,
that's very evident to me.
how wonderful it is that you're still chasing, because look what you've produced. Look, here's another forum in which people are getting to test and taste and look around and hear ideas and different people and different experience. And I think actually the podcast sphere is one of those few places where voices that are generally excluded from the mainstream dialogue can actually be heard, which is a really good thing, you know? Now, we all have to be careful what voices we listen to, but you know what I mean. The other element, and I'll come to the practicality of that in a moment, but the other element of it I think that's really important is recognizing that the first step into the experience is actually knowing the hunger. Because it's the hunger that actually invites us forward. You know? St. Augustine, way back in, nearly 2,000 years ago, one of the great Christian mystics and teachers famously said of God, you have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you. So this restlessness for connection with the divine, with the transcendent, with the mystery, with the other, whatever word you want to put on it, to my mind, it is what defines us as human beings, as opposed to any of the other, animals that are out there. Because so far as we know, the Franciscans, we teach that everything else is still in communion with the mystery, but that we're trying to find our way back into communion with the mystery. So, in that sense, the dog or the crow is in a higher state than we are in that sense. So I think there's three things. The first is to actually make space for real spiritual experience. And that doesn't mean chasing it. It doesn't mean going out. It means going in. So being able to stabilize oneself in stillness that is open and listening is one of the most important spiritual practices. So again, if you go to any of the great spiritual traditions, the first thing they will teach the practitioner is this basic mindful awareness of the present moment. Now, I don't mean mindfulness, the kind of, the sort of the courses that are everywhere and all that. And they're good in and of themselves, in the sense that they bring people to quiet or calm. But I'm talking about actual deep spiritual practice that begins to recognize that I need to go into that hunger. I need to find that place of hunger in myself and dive deep down within it and admit that this hunger is present, and then allow that hunger to orient every other experience of my life. So if I'm falling in love with somebody, my question has to be, is this coming from a place of spiritual hunger, or is it coming from a place of just fulfilling needs? And while there's nothing wrong with the basic fulfilling of needs, if I want real union and real spiritual transcendence in that relationship, then it has to come from a place of spiritual hunger. The same is true for my work. The same is true for my connection with others. So we would speak of the difference between meaning and purpose. Purpose is I get up in the morning and I have a list of jobs to do, right? I know I've got to brush my teeth and dress myself and get on the bus and go to work or whatever it might be. That's purpose. And I can tick off those at the end of the day, no problem. But if I'm just living purpose, I will discover this hole within myself that isn't actually conferring meaning. And meaning is the stuff that confers deep happiness and the ability to connect to this deep spiritual experience. If I'm living from meaning, then meaning will in turn bestow purpose. Meaning will actually allow me to recognize, here are the activities that will actually bring me into the space of meaning. Here are the things that I need to do, the disciplines that I need to have. And they're the same basic disciplines in most traditions, creating space for stillness, compassionate action, trusting the story to actually bring one to illumination by not just recognizing it as a story, but actually living it, by recognizing that it's giving me transcendent lessons and pieces of wisdom that I can actually incarnate into my own experience. To give a perfect example, the United States at the moment is saying we're a Christian nation, and is ignoring the fact that Christ said the love of money is the root of all evil. It's one line. It's the essence of the gospel.
Mm-hmm.
It's a stark piece of teaching. But again, we can't really define ourselves as a Christ follower if we're not accepting the fullness of the teaching, And so what I would say to you then is, the next thing is put yourself in the way of good teachers. And this is how you know a good teacher, regardless of what tradition they come from. It's not about them. They don't ask for money. They don't ask to have any kind of power over you, especially around decision making. And if you said to them in the morning, I'm off, they wouldn't mind and they'd love you just the same. That's a good teacher. Okay? Anybody who's about money, power, taking away freedom or choice, or sitting down with you and saying, you have to be exactly like me, run the opposite direction straight away, because they're actually just processing their own trauma through you, right? So find the person who's generally and genuinely actually just trying to live it as best they can and is kind of bothered by the fact that you even want to ask their advice. That's the person to go to. And then at this stage, recognize that this is the work of a lifetime. It's the work of an absolute lifetime. There's a reason we, in the Christian tradition and the Catholic tradition, we canonize people after they're dead. It's because that's the only time we're sure they won't make a mistake. Okay? So there are no saints before then. There are no saints before then. There's an icon that used to be present in every monastery. And it's an icon called the Ladder of Heaven. You can Google it and look it up. And it shows a big ladder going from earth to heaven. And there's all little monks going along the ladder. And what it shows is that at the very top, just as a guy is stepping into heaven, he's falling. And it's the idea that, not until you're in are you in. A human being will always make mistakes. Human being will always make mistakes. Our danger is we canonize people before they're in, and then we get upset when they fall. Of course they're going to fall, human beings.
Sure.
So, good teacher. The last piece, I would say, more than anything else, and it's the bit that's missing for most people, unfortunately, is get out into nature as much as you can. Nature is the greatest teacher of all, because it has no ego. So just be with the trees, be with the stones, be with the sky, be with the water, and ask it to teach you, ask it to tell you, ask it to speak to you. St. Augustine, go back to him again, famously said, God wrote 2 books, the book of the scriptures and the book of nature. And we have not read his word if we can't read both. So the problem is, if we get locked into scripture only, sola scriptura, we forget all of the great gift and grace that's out there, and we treat everything that's out there then as something to be used rather than as something to be in relationship with. When we're in relationship with it, the transcendent begins to happen. the experience begins to happen. The Dalai Lama famously said, meditation over thousands of years becomes a laboratory of the mind and of the soul. Because we recognize that over time, if we're doing the same thing, if we're teaching people the same way, the same things begin to happen. People begin to change and grow and expand and move and shift and begin to have these experiences of transcendence and move. It's real if it's not egoic, and if it stretches you with compassion, and if it bestows peace. If it makes you think that you're kind of the best ever and over others, then it's a false egoic experience and it can be let go. I don't know if that's helpful, but
it's very helpful.
Know any good teachers? Just kidding.
I'm still looking.
No, that's really beautiful. It seems obvious to me that the ability to find stillness and to cultivate the discipline necessary to get stillness on a regular basis was something that was missing in my life early. And I feel like, especially in the last few years, I've been playing catch up really hardcore because, like, I'm as they say, a grown ass man now. I turn 41 next month, and I'm trying to. Tom, you'll get there eventually.
I'm happy I'm only 35.
Yeah. Count your blessings, my friend. You still have your youth.
On both hands.
This morning, I did a 30-minute meditation, and 25 minutes of that I was dozing off. It's just very, very hard to do this.
Here's a principle for meditation, which is really important, because people don't get this, and this is absolutely essential. The distraction is part of the practice. This is key. I know so many people say, I tried meditation, I was totally distracted, I left it. You're like, no, that's part of the practice. So if what you're trying to do is to strengthen the muscle of focus and attention, inner attention, which is atrophied in most of the Western world now at this stage, right? Absolutely atrophied.
We can't figure out why.
No, we don't actually start with meditation. We start with basic stillness practices because they just haven't done it before. Like we start with 2-minute practices, okay? So the way to see it is when I focus, when I'm sitting and centered and I'm saying, I am here in whatever way I'm doing that, whatever ritual, that is the focus moment. And then the distractions come and the person goes, oh, this is useless. There's no point. And off they go. But if you see it as building muscle, what you are effectively doing is taking your inner interior, whatever you want to call it, soul, consciousness, mind, you're taking that to the gym. Now, if I was to tell you to build up the biceps, you'd go and you'd lift the weight and you put it down, and you lift the weight and you put it down. And it's in the lifting and the putting down that the muscle grows.
Sure.
So when I say, here I am, I'm doing my meditation, I'm lifting the weight. The distraction is putting it down. It only grows if I lift again.
As I mentioned at the beginning, an unreliable internet cut us off before we could properly close the show. Thankfully, even though we kept having connection issues, we got Brother Richard back long enough for an epilogue. We got to talk about what the Fae actually are, hint, it's complicated, as well as why believing everything a non-human intelligence tells you is dangerous, and how these things feed on attention. Finally, because he couldn't help himself, Tom asked Brother Richard for his take on a particular passage from the Gospel of Thomas. If you want to hear it, go to godsghostsufos.com or find the link in the description. See you next week, friends.